can buy the back issues on their website and get the PDF version of that if you want. So, as he mentioned, I started thinking of the 250th of the nation, and as part of that, what were the communities like here before the revolution came? So, of course, primary economic activity for most people is going to be agriculture. So I was interested in what did they grow, how did they grow it, but for me, perhaps even more compelling was why did they grow those things? The motivations behind their growth patterns, in addition to just feeding their families. Okay. So these are the three things, or four things we're mostly going to look at. So thanks to the town of Montgomery historian Mary Ellen Matisse, I became aware of the Cadwallader Colden Farm Journal that is owned by the Rosenbach Museum in Philadelphia. And she had scans of most of the pages of that. So I was able to go through that. His farm was at Coldenham, and I don't have the pointer, but on that map, the red star all the way at the top on the right, if you were close enough, this is a 1780 map, that says Coldenham up there. So even though the word orange is right below that, that actually was Ulster County at that time. The border changed. So that's why in my title I say Orange and Ulster, because he was Ulster. Then Hector St. John de Crèvecoeur, and he was a French immigrant. His farm was on the border between Chester and current Blooming Grove. Pine Hill Farm is still a farm. The Conklin family has had it for many years. So we have some of his writings we'll look at. We're also going to look at some of the merchant records. I became very interested in, since they were doing a lot of bartering, what farm products were they bartering to get their imported goods or goods that other people had made. And also the ledger of John Vale of Goshen, and he was the first supervisor of the town of Goshen, and that ledger is in private hands, and copies were shared with me to kind of extract information from that. Okay. So we've located all the different things. Down in that corner, that's where Baird's Tavern is in Warwick. Goshen is Vale, and then we also have Hector St. John. Okay. That's a great map, by the way. It shows the main roads. 1780, they were showing the main roads and where people were. So let's take a look at Cadwallader. Cadwallader Colden Sr., very important man. He was Surveyor General. First he came here from Scotland, became Surveyor General, and later Governor, and wrote many, many things. Looking at Cadwallader's writings is a lifetime in and of itself, so I just concentrated on the Farm Journal and a couple of letters. There are collections of his scientific letters. What's he growing? Now, can any of you read the words? See the word in the middle? What's that? Harrowed? You can read this, I guarantee, if you watch with harrowed. Underneath began in the north end. So he's giving us very specific directions of where he's planting things, how he's preparing the soil, and he often comes back later and makes a notation on how it did. These are all of the things that he's growing. He is growing apples, artichokes, beans, beef, buckwheat, burnet, cabbages, carrots, celery, cherries, clover, corn, cresses, cucumbers, haws, hemp, kale, leeks, lettuce, marjoram, melons, oats, onions, parsnips, peaches, pears, peas, peppers, poppies, pumpkins, radishes, rye, sage, scallions, spinach, squashes, thyme, tobacco, turnips, and wheat. So in this journal, which is not super long, those are all the different things that he mentions. Now, we don't have a diagram of how his farm is laid out. The ruins are still there in the town of Montgomery, but it's really just a couple of crumbling walls. But there are people that have walked there and tried to figure out, maybe this was a well here, maybe this was a partial canal or ditch here. But you really can't tell where he planted things other than the directions he gives us. Began in the north end of the field. The mold in the south end, not so mellow as in the north, and fuller of clots. Throwed small quantities of hot clover seed behind the house at the south end of the wheat field in a little wet ground. So he's explaining to you where he's putting things, and he was of a scientific bent of mind. So how many of you have a garden journal? Do you ever have a garden or keep a garden journal, right? Yeah. Were you able to keep it up with any reasonable accuracy after the first couple of 6 months? So his farm journal kind of devolves into paid so much for doing this for me and that. It becomes much less descriptive of the crops a little later on. Okay. So this farm journal is earlier than you would think a lot of times. 1727 to 1736. Now, when I was growing up, I was taught to consider this the era of, they're just scratching a living and they're not really too well educated. But of course, he was very highly educated. He was really the epitome of an Enlightenment man. Of course, the scientific correspondence of his day was conducted in Latin. They knew Latin well enough to do all of their writings for each other in Latin, the common language of the scientific community at that time. And the ideals they were following in a lot of ways were those of the Stoic philosophers, the ancient Stoic philosophers. So Colden is longing to withdraw from the hustle and bustle of his business and government duties. That's one reason why he gets the farm. He wants to withdraw, pursue these scientific interests of his, and sees that as a way of betterment of himself as a human. So he has some specific goals. His specific goal might have been to feed the family, but at least early on, it's really taking second seat to, let's find out about this stuff. He's very curious. He corresponded with Carl Linnaeus, who was the guy that came up with the binomial system of naming things in Latin that we still use today. There are letters to and from him. And he also was corresponding with people like Peter Collinson. Now, he trained his daughter Jane in botany. I'm not going to really talk about Jane. I'm a big fan of Jane. Jane could draw plants, and she did a botanical manuscript where she drew the native plants, made notations of their description and sometimes of their uses. That manuscript survived, and parts of it have been published. I bet Anne's got a copy here in the library of Jane Colden's journal. So he enlisted his daughter Jane to help him discover things. Now, one of Cadwallader's great loves was apples, and this is a page from his journal showing these weird things here. Those are the names of the apple varieties he's growing, right? And he is grafting them onto a rootstock using a slit graft. This is 1731. And in this column, you see Roman numerals. Probably because it's easier to incise Roman numerals on the stems of grafted plants than our numeral system. And then he's telling you how many. So he's planting lots of varieties of apples. So here's the varieties he mentions. You might recognize some. Ellison's Summer Golden Pippin, Rhinet and Golden Rhinet, Golden Russeting, Kentish Codling, Newtown Pippin, Nonpareil, Pulse Bow, Pulse Eating, Pulse Keeping, Pippin, Pomeroy, Red Streak, Russet Shire, and Spitzenberg. So those are just some of the apple varieties he mentions. I have pictures of some of them here. If you go to an orchard that specializes in heritage strains, you can buy some of these still. There's one in Vermont. If you go to the one in Vermont, go when they open on a weekday, because in the fall, busloads of tourists from all over the world come to be able to buy one of those precious apples. But boy, it's a fun thing. I don't know of anybody in the area here that does actual tastings, right? How to distinguish an apple from another one, right? Wouldn't that be fun? Right? Okay. So, here we go. So those are the apples. That's a red streak, and that's from. If you're interested in apple varieties, if you're not familiar with the tome called The Apples of New York, gorgeous illustrations of the heritage apples that New York is known for. So we mentioned Colden's daughter Jane and her botanical manuscript about native plants. The effort to know and describe resources here was already well underway. Colden and other early scientist farmers sought out and experimented with crops indigenous to North America, or as we might say today, bioprospecting. They are looking for things they can grow that'll work to sell, right? So of course they learned about them from the Native Americans. Maize or Indian corn, which was not known before, became a staple crop for the settler colonists. In 1728, Colden records, on the 11th of May, we began planting our Indian corn and ended the 16th. One half planted with the early white corn and the other with the yellow corn. We planted some of the small round white kidney beans with them, and squashes and pumpkins. About the same time, some cucumbers and squashes in the garden. He came back later and noted that the white corn was later than the yellow and did not ripen well. Now, in that one statement, we see that Colden is actually planting what? Does anybody know what the combination of corn, beans, squash is called?
Three Sisters.
Three Sisters. He is doing the Native American Three Sisters method of planting of these plants. He doesn't say so, but that's exactly what he's doing. And when you're looking back at records in this time period, and you're just going to love going and finding more and analyzing them and helping us all learn more, there's a lot more out there. You have to be careful when you see the word corn. Today, when we say corn, we mean maize. We mean a specific crop. In the 18th century, corn meant any grain. Anybody here old enough to be familiar with the song John Barley Corn? John Barley Corn? That's the holdover of the usage of that name for other things, right? So, we have the diary of one of the German soldiers in Burgoyne's army, the captured army that was brought down to our area in late 1777. And he describes, between Goshen and Florida, the great fields of corn. Now, even if we could find the manuscript and see what German word he's using, because I'm working with translations, we don't know. But my guess is he's saying that there are hundreds and hundreds of acres of Indian corn. I think he's just noting that there are many different fields of different grains moving down through. If anybody ever figures it out, that'll be great, but I have not been able to find the manuscript. Now, Colden, in addition to talking about this a little bit, writes a letter to Dutch scientist Jan Gronovius in 1745. We are well assured that all the Indian nations, as far north as New England, planted maize when the English and Dutch first discovered them. And it is for this reason that we use the name Indian corn. He goes on to describe, and if you're interested, I can give you a link, that this tribe raised this type of corn. This is what it looked like. These tribes raised this type of corn. This is what that looked like. So he is differentiating the maize crops that the different Native American groups are talking about. So in this statement, we also see something else about the global reach of crops at this time period. He mentions cucumbers. Where are cucumbers from? Anybody know? The origin of cucumbers? India. India. So this is a global thing that he's doing, right? Now we're going to turn to Hector St. John de Crèvecoeur. And I'm going to probably mostly call him St. John because it's a little bit easier saying. So Hector St. John was a French minor noble, came over to Canada and fought in the French and Indian War on the French side. Then after the war, he decided to come down here. So he migrated to the New York colony. He traveled around quite a bit first. Now he shortens his name in a lot of the records as St. John. You can see Hector St. John. That's the title page of the book he first published. And why do you think he's doing that? How many veterans of the French and Indian War you think lived in this area?
Not many.
Quite a few. Quite a few guys served in the French and Indian War from our area. So he is trying to mitigate that prejudice, right? He's well aware of it, apparently. Now, he writes these letters as if they are a fictional series of letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania. This is a literary convention. St. John was kind of a literary sort of a guy. He's more literary than scientific. So he has juiced up his letters by saying that they're from a guy in Pennsylvania. He was out in Pennsylvania. So when you look at the specific things he's saying, you know they are his experience, St. John's experience, his observations. So I treat this book, Letters from an American Farmer, as a primary source, even though it is somewhat fictionalized, because you can't make this stuff up. Right? He's telling you real things. Now, he published this in 1783 while he was in exile. The story of St. John and his family is very compelling and an example of what happens if you can't take sides and there's a big fight. He had just come and become a naturalized citizen of the New York colony, a British citizen, sworn his oath to King George. He is forced out. He's forced out and away from his home. He leaves his wife and children at Pine Hill to try to keep the property for him. He goes down to New York. They don't like him in New York either because they think he's a spy for the other side. They lock him up for a while. He finally makes it to England where he's got no money now, no income. So he puts together from his various essays, and it's described that he has his essays under a false bottom in his trunk. They think he's trying to sneak out contraband, and it's his manuscripts. He publishes them in London. Now this book, you may not have heard of this book, but if you go in and Google, what is an American? That is perhaps his most famous essay, where he tries to define at this time period what it means to be an American. It's still used in college courses today. Okay. This is Pine Hill. This is his farm. He painted it before he left. This is perhaps the only image of an 18th century farmstead in our area that exists. If you find another one, I'll be very excited. Please tell me. So, you see what? When I was taught, they were just living in log cabins, all of them, and they were just sort of rubbing around with a pointed stick, right? No, it's a fine frame farmhouse that before the Revolution he built. You see the log cabin, which was probably the first dwelling that he and his wife, he married a woman, Dutch woman from the Hudson Valley. That's probably where they live while they're building the house. So maybe the servants, the enslaved people might be living there now. Right below that, there's a well sweep. Do you guys know what a well sweep is? Early machine, counterbalanced lever, so that it was easier to get the water up from the well. So, example of simple machine. There's a well sweep. Now, the architecture of this house is a little bit odd. There are these two things on either side. This is not at all typical of the architecture of our area at this time period. What are they? They're breezeways, they're mudrooms. What the heck is up with that? If you look at what an 18th century French chateau looked like, I think he was bringing in an element that made him think of home. Or he considered it eminently practical, right? He also has this little building to the right with these tiny little windows. He doesn't talk about this building that we can say exactly what it is. Looks a little bit like a poultry house to me. Doesn't it look like a chicken coop, kind of? Right? You can't really tell, but I think so. The house is not surrounded by howling wilderness. The house is surrounded by neat picket fences. So this is a very fine establishment. So he is sitting, I think, there's a knoll opposite the house. And I think he was sitting up on that knoll and looking back at the house. Now, there was a black and white version of this published before. In, is it in Minnesink? Is it in the Minnesink book? Tales of Minnesink or something. I went looking and said, well, wouldn't it be great if we had an actual image of this painting? Where I found it was a color photograph of this painting, which is now in France, I don't know where, at the St. Johnsbury Athenaeum in Vermont. They had it in their catalog. St. Johnsbury. St. John. Ethan Allen named St. Johnsbury for this St. John. That's what they were doing with it. Somebody at some point in history found that painting in France and said, can you please send us a copy so that we can see better what the painting looked like. Okay, this is only a portion of the painting. We will see the whole thing momentarily. Now the thing that isn't in that painting is the barn. That's sort of weird that he's not showing the barn. Maybe he was sitting in the barn door up on that knoll, right? That would have been a little bit far from the house, but Who knows what he cooked up, since he was apparently a rebel, architecturally speaking. This is a typical bank barn of the 18th century. Why would people build barns like that? Does anybody know? Probably some farm people in here to know why you would build a barn into a bank. If you want.
Yeah.
Go ahead. If you want. Yes, sir.
The cattle are down below and the hay is brought in up top.
Right.
And dropped down.
Right. You do not have to carry that hay. You can roll that hay to the top, right? So that's why you build it into. They weren't dumb. They wanted to ease their work whenever they could. So this is an existing barn. So St. John tells us about the barn, even though he doesn't really describe it. Okay, he says, the barn is an object in the mind of a farmer superior even to that of his dwelling. Therein we lodge all our grain, and within many operations are performed, such as threshing, cleaning of flax, and husking of corn. In the summer, the women resort to it in order to spin their wool. A great draught of air is caused by the opened doors. So the good ventilation is something they really valued. Colden also gives us a little detail on the use of the barn. In 1743, July 1st brought 10 wagon loads of hay out of the meadow in the west field. July 3rd, 7 loads out of the north field. 5 loads from the middle field. In all, 22 loads put in the barn. In addition to this, put in the stack 14 loads of all the hay got before the harvest. There were 36 loads. Now these are giant wagon loads of hay, so they're getting in as much hay as they can. That's the whole painting. I've cropped out a little bit of the landscape around the house, but now we see a fuller view. Now, in the foreground, you have a guy plowing, right? That guy's a black guy. That is probably an enslaved person working on the farm. This may be the only image we have from this time period of an enslaved person working a local farm. We don't know his name. We don't know what happened to him. But he is clearly, when you look at a high-res scan of that, that's a black man plowing. And in addition to plowing, he's such a happy laborer that he's given a ride to one of the children of the household on that plow. What an idyllic view. Isn't that just the most charming thing? Where's the farmer and his wife? Sitting in the shade in the back. To me, this is an astounding document that is unique possibly in our area. Okay. Now, we know some of St. John's attitudes towards black servants from his writings. He wrote deploringly of the horrific conditions and brutality of slavery in the South. He recognized that. But he also advises the new farmer, after being possessed of the land, one must have a team and a Negro. He also notes that our Negro kitchens are always built adjacent to our dwelling houses with a door of communication into the room where we eat, in order that we may inspect whatever passes there. And indeed, it is the room which is often the most useful, for all housework is done in it. Now, while this talk can't address the lives of the enslaved of our area beyond a few notes, I advise those interested in this topic, there is a book called Under Old Roof Trees, written by E.B. Hornby, and a whole chapter is given to memories of northern slaves. So she writes down her memories of enslaved persons in the household that she grew up in that book. And she captures appearance, speech patterns, folk beliefs. It's pretty wild stuff. Some of the things in that book she records, you go, that's weird. And then you research it and you're like, that's from Africa. Right? So that's an awesome, awesome resource. Okay. Now, St. John just loved to write very flowery things. It flows well. He was a good writer. Even certain persons who like good grammatical things would be happy with his writing, I think. He talks about the same kind of crops that Colvin talks about. Pole beans, apples, cabbages, potatoes, pumpkins, tobacco, hemp again. They kept giving a shot at hemp. And of course hemp was ropes, ship ropes and things like that. That's what they're using that for, fiber. And hemp, of course, hemp cloth was something. Hops, rye, buckwheat, corn, and wheat. So he often, in a later essay published after Letters from an American Farmer, the title is Various Rural Subjects. That's the one that's got a lot of nitty-gritty about the farms. We have another convenience to preserve our roots and vegetables in the winter, which we commonly call a Dutch cellar. It is built at the foot of a rising ground, which is dug through, about 18 feet long and 6 feet high. It's walled up about 7 feet from the ground, then strongly roofed and covered with sods. The door always faces south. There it never freezes, being under the ground. In these places we keep our apples, turnips, cabbages, potatoes, and pumpkins, and the cellars under the houses are for cider, milk, and butter, and meat, and other necessities. So, this is an illustration of an old-timey root cellar, or Dutch cellar. I'm pretty sure we probably have some still existing in this area, right? Every once in a while on social media, I will see people posting pictures of things that look like this that are in the woods, talking about that they're indigenous structures or whatnot. Well, if there is anything like a house foundation or evidence of settler occupation there, that's a root cellar. One of the more astounding descriptions that St. John gives us. I went running around the house because I could not believe this when I read this, is how they dried apples. Now, in our minds, we have a picture. The fireplace, the apples strung so nicely over the fireplace. How much production do you think you would get out of that if you were trying desperately to get as much product out as you could? That's not a very efficient way to do it. So what did they use? They used bugs. This is what he says. In the fall of the year, we dry great quantities of apples. After the ladies all come over and they do the peeling and coring, and they have a little party afterward, a little apple bee, they were called. The next day, a great stage is erected where the cattle can't come. Strong crotches are planted in the ground. Poles are fixed horizontally on these and boards laid close together. The scaffold thus erected, the apples are thinly spread over it. They are soon covered with all the bees and wasps and sucking flies of the neighborhood. This accelerates the process of drying. Now and then they are turned. At night they're covered with blankets. If it's likely to rain, they are gathered and brought into the house. And it's repeated until they are all perfectly dry. Bugs. Where did they learn that? How did they figure that out? I don't know. This is the only time I've seen this written down, but it's pretty clear. Yeah, this makes perfect sense. How would you like to be the person sent out to turn the apples? Not too fun. Okay, now we're going to look at merchant ledgers for a little while. So this is the ledger of John Vail, who, as I said, he was a farmer merchant here in Goshen, first supervisor. And I was given the skins and I extracted some of the information. This is a portion of his transactions with Thomas Wickham. So he records all these things that he is selling to Thomas Wickham, and he's also recording labor days, so charges for days that he has labored for Thomas Wickham. So he's a typical farmer merchant of the area. He's primarily selling product off his farm to other locals and diversifying his income stream by hiring himself out, doing other skilled labor. And you see kind of the typical things. He helps get the wood in. He also sells 3.5 pounds of tobacco. What was he doing with 3.5 pounds of tobacco? They kept trying to grow tobacco here, but the growing season really isn't long enough to do that very well. And also things like corn and wheat and cider. Okay. I'm sure there are lots more of these kinds of records in Orange County. So if you know anybody that has some, that would be fun to see more. Okay, so now we're going to turn our attention to that enterprising man, Francis Baird. And we have a descendant of this gentleman in our house today. This is Jim Baird, if you don't know him. So, remember, my question is not only what are they growing and how, but why? But why? So I was interested in following the money. Francis Baird's ledger for the winter of 73-74, the original appears to have disappeared, but a photocopy was made of it, so we have a photocopy of it. So that's cool, because that's right before the war starts. I went through and analyzed that. So this particular entry, Cornelius Decker's son-in-law, is buying 8 yards of check, so that's fabric, and he's buying 4 skeins of thread, the 3 pounds of tobacco, don't seem like a lot of tobacco, and he is exchanging 6 bushels, 6 quarts of wheat for that. So this is showing Baird doing the charged to and the paid by of that transaction. So now we're coming to a bit of hard history. So when he's taking in these things, he's taking them in for a specific purpose because there's a market for them, right? When you go through his ledger, you'll see it is a lot of wheat. And the numbers on this side are pounds, shillings, and pence. They're still using pounds, shillings, and pence. So for this short time period, 168 bushels of wheat and 328 bushels of ashes he is taking in payment for goods. These are 2 highly in-demand products. These are things that are being taken in during the winter, and we'll see, they're going someplace else. That picture gives you a clue. There's a place where they can't grow wheat, where they have to feed a lot of people. There's no evidence he was reselling the ashes. He was a tanner, but if you look back at what tanning was like, he wasn't really using the ashes for tanning. Okay. We know a little bit about why he's taking all of this from a couple of primary sources. A man named Patrick McRobert was traveling up the Hudson, August of 1774. He says, here on the west bank of the river is a little town called Windsor, having a good quay and large granaries and stores for holding the grain of the adjacent country, where it is brought to be sent to New York for exportation. They also have many landing places at convenient distances up the river where granaries are built for the same purpose. Here the country people for 30 or 40 miles bring their wheat on sleighs or sledges in the snow in the winter. A pair of horses can draw 30 bushels of wheat on one of these sledges, 30 miles in the snow, and get home the same day. So that is a primary source observation of many granaries along the Hudson. Now, how did they manage all of that? How did these people with the primitive tools manage that kind of production? Well, first you got to mow it. You use a scythe or a sickle if you're unlucky and you don't have the big tool. You use this. I actually know somebody that when she was a girl, her grandmother made her harvest with one of these. My grandfather was the lead man on a scything crew in rural Pennsylvania during the Depression. So first you got to scythe it. Then you have to tie the sheaves together and stack them in the field. Then you got to bring it to the barn. That barn floor that St. John tells us was also a threshing floor. There you beat it with something called a flail to bust the heads of the grain off from the stalks, and you end up with the grains. And then you wait for a breezy day. And then you got to toss those grains up in the air and let the breeze carry the chaff away. Well, that's pretty labor intensive to end up with hundreds and hundreds of bushels of wheat, isn't it? That's pretty hard. I don't know how they managed it. Well, this is how they managed it. When you look at the technology from this time period, they went from hand winnowing, tossing it up in a sheet and into the breeze, to something called a fanning mill. Okay. So the fanning mills. In April of 1761, New Hampshire Gazette says, it's a Dutch machine for winnowing grain. 2 boys can winnow 100 bushels of wheat in a day. It makes all the wind at once and lays the grain, the chaff, the cobs in 3 different heaps. 2 boys, 15 or 16, winnowed 21 bushels of rye in 50 minutes. A useful instrument for a farmer, being not very cumbersome to move from place to place, might serve a large neighborhood. So the Industrial Revolution is starting to creep in, right? This was invented in England and Holland. How do we know they had them here? Because St. John tells us so. Each provident farmer must have a fanning mill by means of which he cleans his grain with very little trouble. I have 4 sets of riddles or sieves for mine, each fitted for different sorts of grains. He that has it not often loses a great deal of time for want of wind, or else must submit to the labor of fanning. They are most indispensably useful to a northern farmer in order to convey his grain on the snow to whatever market he chooses. For when the snow falls, it is necessary to take the opportunity it offers. So you have harvest, a brief period of months to process it, and then as soon as that ground is hard and there's some snow for the sleighs, but not too deep, because then that's a problem too, if the snow's too deep, they're moving it over to the Hudson. Okay, so now we understand what Francis Baird was doing with all that wheat. We're going to talk about ashes too. He was a middleman. He was taking in lots of wheat during the winter. There is somebody who says that that large attic was used for storing grain. W.B. Sayer tells us that. Once the technology was in place to quickly process the grain, we have several sources confirming that the cash crop, like wheat, were hauled over to the Hudson when the ground was frozen. Now, we're going to take a look at what a granary looks like, because my next question was, how did that guy in the middle of the Hudson River know there were granaries? What did they look like? That's the granary at Hillhold Museum. And it's a small one, like you would have on just a farm. There are louvered areas for ventilation along the sides, right? So that's just kind of a general farm one. Now, I've been to botanical gardens where they have these lovely stone mushrooms. They are the cutest things. Well, if you look carefully at them, they're Stattle stones. The granaries were raised up on these. Why? Because when you have that projecting lip, what can't get in? Mice, rats, right? So that to me is a clue for how a guy in the river could know there were granaries when it looks sort of like a regular building, right? He probably could recognize them from the fact that they were standing on Stattle stones. I don't know if we have any Stattle stones around here. My guess is they're being used as stone mushrooms in people's gardens. Okay. Now, we have even more evidence to what was happening. So on the this side here, that's that 1761 article that's talking about how quick those boys. What kind of boys were they? Were they, well, any boys you could grab, your sons, your apprentices, your enslaved persons, whoever was in the neighborhood you would assign to do that. That's not, you don't need a lot of skill to just keep turning that crank, right? These are the average exports from New York Harbor to the West Indies per year. Tons, 1,300 tons of bread and flour. Flaxseed, which you can also grind and use in baked product, in bread, 23,000 bushels, Indian corn 13,000 bushels, and wheat 12,000 bushels every year. Okay, it's going down to New York. It's being exported. There was a vast trade network. How do you tell where most of it's going? Some of it might have been going across the Atlantic. It's possible. But there's a study that was done of the role of exports in the economy of North America, which is where these figures came from. So I advise you to look at that. Okay. Now, we have even more evidence of this. None of this should come as a surprise. In 1908, Russell Hedley wrote in his History of Orange County, John Chandler, previously to 1759, kept a general store at Blooming Grove for several years, also near Aidenville in Warwick, taking in wheat and other grain which was carted to New Windsor, ground at the old mill on Quassia Creek, and shipped to the West Indies in exchange for sugar, molasses, and other products of the tropics, which were brought back to Orange County either on the river to New Windsor and exchanged again. So we have enough primary sources to be able to say that yes, indeed, the market-driven demand, right? Our farmers are taking advantage of that to make a cash crop and to export a cash crop. Now let's take a look at those ashes, because that's sort of weird, right? You guys clean the ashes out of your fireplace or wood stove, and then you think, well, maybe I could sprinkle a few on the garden, but if you put a little bit too much on, then you got problems and you're going to wreck your soil. You take the ash. The other major export of this area that we have evidence for is potash. If you process those hardwood ashes into potash, that's the primary industrial chemical of this time period. They used it to make glass, soaps, dyes, saltpeter for gunpowder. It was the alkali used in textile industries for bleaching linens and scouring woollens. So farmers aren't throwing their ashes out. They're turning everything on the farm. You wouldn't think of ashes as a crop, right? Well, yeah, it was something that helped them out. Now this is a picture of the fire at Greenwood Lake last fall. That was horrific and tragic for all concerned, especially our first responders. One life was lost, and it was horrifying. But I also, at night, when I looked at the burning fires, thought of Hector St. John and what he says. To achieve the end of good forage for the livestock, the method which is yearly made use of to render the feed of our mountains sweet, tender, and good, is to burn them. You must not imagine that by this operation we consume the trees. In April, the neighbors of each mountain district assemble and, taking advantage of the wind, set fire to the leaves. The fire forms itself in a regular line and advances toward the tops of the mountains. This scene, viewed at a distance through the trees, yields a very pleasing effect at night. As soon as the operation of burning the mountains is over, which sometimes requires many days, it is surprising to see how amazingly quickly every vegetable will spring up. The heat of this transitory fire and the few ashes it leaves greatly accelerates the growth of every shrub and weeds and plants and grass. So they are using fire to make sure that the browse under the trees is staying good for the livestock. The cows and perhaps the pigs are taken up. Almost every farmer had a wood lot. You're going to manage your wood very carefully for heat and for boards. They're also using the space under the cool trees in summer. They're not going to carry hay to their cows in the summer. So that's an example of some of the benefits, and that tells us some of the other uses of ashes. So when you're talking about export, hardwood ash contains 5% potassium. When you leach it with water, it makes potash. The average export of potash from the New York colony in this time period was 89 tons. And you need 450 to 500 bushels of ashes to make 1 ton of potash. We had ads of people during this time period selling potash kettles. The farmers were doing that themselves, also making their own potash. Now, we're almost done, but we can't leave farming in the 18th century here without talking about the horrible, terrible, no, the very bad things that can happen. Okay. Colden, in September of 1727, tells us about the drought. The weather very warm and dry. No rain has fallen except once about the last of August. All the brooks are dried up. St. John, the grasshoppers, the ravages of grasshoppers, an intolerable nuisance. While young and deprived of wings, they must be kept off by means of a few pots of brimstone and tar kindled at night. The powerful smell either kills them or drives them away. So the hordes of locusts and grasshoppers. Under old roof trees in 1816, did anybody ever hear of the eruption of the Tambora volcano in Indonesia? Right? There was a killing frost in every month of 1816 because of that eruption in 1815. There was so much ash in the sky. We don't normally think of things like storms and lightning as a disaster, but it was for them until St. John tells us, would you believe that the great electrical discoveries of Mr. Franklin have preserved our barns and houses from the fire of heaven? Franklin invented lightning rods, and they were using them in pre-revolutionary area. They didn't know exactly how they worked. In this time period, they're still thinking it's the thunder that does the damage. They're not really understanding electrical charges quite so much as Ben did, but they're using them. And of course, if you've got all of your produce in your barn, and the barn is struck by lightning, there goes your family, kind of, right? It's a big disaster. John also complains that the kingbirds come and eats all of his bees. He needs those bees to pollinate, and those birds keep coming and picking off his bees. He's really mad about it. And I'll leave you with the last image. So, even as we mourn the loss of our extinct species, you can empathize with the farmers when millions of passenger pigeons would pass through. E.B. Hornby relates, pigeons were very plentiful in the early days. Sometimes the air seemed almost darkened with the immense flocks of these birds. They settled thickly on all the trees and bushes. Can you imagine standing in your door and seeing hundreds and hundreds of these birds come down in your fields and on your fruit trees and all these carefully nurtured crops? Do you wonder that they decided that pigeon pie was one of their very, very favorite things? Right? Philip Hone of Beacon wrote, the air was filled with them. Their undulation was like the long waves of the ocean in a calm, and the fluttering of their wings made a noise like the crackling of fire among dry leaves. So that's something we will never experience. But it's also something we don't have to worry about anymore in some respect, right? So we've taken a tiny little dip into these records. This is not the whole story. It's just when I followed the rabbit hole, this is where it took me. Now, if you are curious and want to get your hands on some of those records, I know there's some people like that in this room. There's a website where I've loaded the transcription of Colden's Farm Journal and the index. You can just go to the website. If you forget the website, pretty easy to find, warwickhistory@gmail.com. So you can go in and have a field day with that. I do have printouts of some of the things here if you want to look at. There's a lovely description of Belleville Farm, and the ads in the newspaper in this time period tell you exactly what amenities are on the farm. Well, there's a whole lot of stuff you could mine. So if anybody wants to give a whack at this, we'll go out and we'll cut some of that grass, ornamental grass out there, and see how good we are. Thank you very much for your kind attention. If there are questions, I will be able to try to answer them. No? Okay, you email me when you go home and you start thinking about those bees on the apples. Feel free to email me. Thank you.
Question here.
Oh, we got
In your first slide, you show the name Cadwalder for the farm. Did Colden buy the farm?
his first name is Cadwalader.
Oh, his first name is...
Cadwalader Colden Sr.
Oh,
Yeah.
thank you.
And his son John ran a farm, ran a store nearby, but we don't really have the extraction of what he was selling in his store. I don't think Cadwalader was terribly successful with selling off-farm product. He was kind of desultory about the whole process. Yeah. Yes, sir.
It was his first name.
On 17A, when you leave Goshen heading toward Florida, on the right-hand side, there's a farm that they sell beef and so on. They have a barn that was designed with huge doors in the middle on one side, huge doors in the middle on the other, and it was designed to open those doors and to blow through to clear the shade.
All right. Yeah. Anybody that's been in a hay mound knows about the dust, right? Yeah, there's a lot of dust involved with hay. Yeah. But that's kind of cool. Yes, sir.
I noticed a couple of the apple varieties had the word Paltz.
Pulse.
Is that from New Paltz or any
Well, what was New Paltz named for?
apples?
Place in Holland, right? Isn't Paltz part of the Netherlands, maybe? I don't know. I didn't research that. There you go, there's your topic. Anybody else? Have fun, enjoy the rest of the day. The sun is shining, it's not snowing. Yay! Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sue. Just two quick notes. Number one, The local history room on the second floor is open for anyone that might be interested today. It's a tremendous library resource. Secondly, the table outside, you may have noticed on your way in, where the new local history journal is available. This is the first publication of its kind, produced by the local history committee, and